I stood in the cemetery watching dirt fall onto my father's casket. The weight of 38 years of memories pressing down on my shoulders like the humid August heat that seemed to make everything harder to bear. Samuel Mitchell had been more than just my dad. He'd been my business partner, my mentor, and the backbone of our small family farm that had been in the Mitchell name for over a century. The funeral had drawn a respectable crowd from our rural Tennessee community. Neighbors and fellow farmers who understood that losing Sam meant losing one of the area's most knowledgeable and hardworking men. But as I watched the last shovelful of earth settle over his grave, I couldn't shake the feeling that my real troubles were just beginning. Mom had passed away when I was 12, leaving Dad and me to figure out farming and life together. We'd made it work through droughts, floods, equipment failures, and market crashes that would have broken lesser partnerships. Now, at 25, I faced the prospect of running the farm alone while dealing with debts I hadn't fully understood the scope of. The bank had already started making noise about overdue payments on equipment loans, and the lawyer handling Dad's estate had scheduled a meeting for tomorrow that filled me with dread. Everything about the adult world of finance and legal matters felt foreign and threatening compared to the simple honesty of working the land. As the small crowd began to disperse, offering final condolences and promises to help however they could, I found myself staring at the old red International Harvester tractor parked near the cemetery gate. Dad had driven that machine to church, to town, and everywhere else when his truck wouldn't start, which was often. It looked as beaten and weathered as I felt, but it had always been reliable when we needed it most. Tomorrow I'd learn just how much my father had protected me from the harsh realities of keeping our farm afloat, and whether his legacy would survive long enough for me to figure out how to honor it properly. Chapter 2. The Reading of the Will. The law office of Henderson & Associates occupied the second floor of the oldest building on Main Street. Its wood-paneled walls and heavy furniture speaking of decades of small-town legal business, conducted with handshakes and reputation rather than contracts and fine print. I sat in an uncomfortable chair while Mr. Henderson shuffled through papers with the deliberate pace of a man who had never been hurried by anyone or— "Your father was a good man, Tommy," Mr. Henderson said, using the childhood name that most people in town still called me, despite my attempts to be taken seriously as an adult farmer. But I'm afraid his financial situation was more complicated than he may have let on. The will itself was straightforward enough. Everything went to me as the sole surviving heir. The problem, as Mr. Henderson explained with uncomfortable pauses and apologetic glances, was that everything included significantly more debt than assets when calculated at current market values. The farm itself is worth perhaps $80,000, given land prices in the area, he continued, consulting notes that seemed to contain nothing but bad news. But the outstanding loans total nearly $120,000, most of it tied to equipment purchases from the last 5 years. I tried to process numbers that seemed impossible given the modest lifestyle Dad and I had always maintained. We'd lived simply, fixed what we could ourselves, and only bought new equipment when the old stuff literally couldn't be repaired anymore. The idea that we'd been operating so far in the red made no sense. "What about the International Harvester?" I asked, remembering how proud Dad had been when he'd bought that tractor used from the Jameson farm auction 3 years ago. Mr. Henderson consulted his papers and frowned. According to the bank's assessment, it's worth maybe $1,500 in its current condition. The loan against it is for $12,000. The gap between what we owed and what we owned seemed impossible to bridge, leaving me wondering how I'd gone from inheriting a family farm to owing more money than I could earn in a decade of good harvests. Chapter 3. Harsh Realities. The drive home from the lawyer's office felt longer than usual, every familiar landmark reminding me of conversations Dad and I had shared about the future of our farm and how we'd pass it on to the next generation. The weight of learning that there might not be a next generation to pass it to made the truck's old bench seat feel like it was made of concrete. I parked next to the farmhouse and sat for several minutes, staring at the buildings and fields that had shaped my entire life. The barn needed a new roof, the chicken coop door hung crooked on its hinges, and the fence along the back pasture required posts that I couldn't afford to buy. Everything looked different when viewed through the lens of financial reality, rather than the pride of ownership. Walking through the house felt like exploring a museum of my childhood, each room holding memories of a simpler time when Dad's presence had made every problem seem solvable. His coffee cup still sat in the sink where he'd left it the morning he'd had his heart attack while checking on the cattle. I couldn't bring myself to wash it. just like I couldn't bring myself to accept that he was really gone. The kitchen table was covered with condolence cards from neighbors and friends, many containing offers to help with whatever I needed. But what I needed was a miracle that could erase six-figure debt without requiring me to sell the land that had been in my family since my great-great-grandfather first cleared it with an axe and a mule. That evening, I called my Uncle Frank in Missouri, Dad's only living brother who'd left farming 30 years ago to work in a factory. He listened sympathetically to my situation, but offered little beyond emotional support and a suggestion that maybe it was time to consider whether farming was still a viable way of life. "Maybe you could keep the house and a few acres," Frank suggested with the practical tone of someone who'd made peace with compromise long ago. "Sell the rest to a developer, or a bigger operation that can make it profitable." The idea of breaking up our farm felt like a betrayal of everything Dad had worked for. But I was beginning to understand that sentiment might be a luxury I couldn't afford. Chapter 4. Unexpected Visitors. 3 days after the funeral, I was in the barn trying to fix a hydraulic leak on the hay baler when I heard a car pull into the driveway. Through the open barn door, I could see a late-model pickup truck that I didn't recognize, which was unusual in our small community, where everyone knew everyone else's vehicles by sight. A woman got out of the driver's side, followed by a man who looked to be about my father's age. They both had the weathered appearance of people who'd spent their lives working outdoors, but their clothes and truck suggested they'd done well for themselves. The woman had dark hair streaked with gray and moved with the confident stride of someone accustomed to handling business. I wiped my hands on a shop rag and walked out to meet them, curious about what had brought strangers to our farm during such a difficult time. The woman smiled as I approached, her expression warm but somehow urgent, as if she had important news that couldn't wait for proper introductions. "Are you Tommy Mitchell?" she asked, extending her hand in a firm handshake that reminded me of my father's approach to meeting new people. "Yes, ma'am," I replied, automatically using the manners Dad had drilled into me from childhood. "Can I help you with something?" "I'm Sarah Mitchell," she said, studying my face with an intensity that made me wonder if we'd met before. "This is my husband, Jim. I believe your father was my cousin, though we lost touch many years ago." The name Mitchell wasn't uncommon in Tennessee, but something about her manner suggested this wasn't a coincidence. Sarah had the same green eyes as Dad, and the same stubborn set to her jaw that I'd inherited and sometimes saw in the mirror when I was determined about something. "I heard about Sam's passing," she continued, her voice carrying genuine sadness. "I'm sorry for your loss, and I'm sorry it took something like this to bring us back together. But I think we need to talk about some family business that's been neglected too long." The phrase, family business, triggered warning bells in my mind, reminding me of the financial disaster I was still trying to understand, and the vultures who might see opportunity in our misfortune. Chapter 5. Family Connections. Sarah and Jim followed me into the farmhouse kitchen, where I offered coffee and tried to process the unexpected appearance of relatives I'd never heard Dad mention. Their presence felt both welcome and threatening, offering potential support while raising questions about motives that I couldn't immediately answer. "Your father never mentioned us?" Sarah asked, settling into one of the mismatched chairs around our old kitchen table, with the familiarity of someone who'd grown up in similar surroundings. "No, ma'am," I admitted, pouring coffee from the pot that had been sitting too long on the burner. Dad didn't talk much about family except to say most of them had moved away from farming. Sarah and Jim exchanged glances that suggested they'd expected this response but weren't happy about it. Jim pulled out a worn manila folder from his jacket and set it carefully on the table between us, his movements deliberate and serious. "Sam and I had a falling out about 20 years ago," Sarah explained, her voice carrying the weight of old regrets. "It was over property boundaries and some equipment that belonged to our grandfather. Stubborn pride kept us from speaking, even though we both knew we were being..." The mention of equipment made me think immediately of the International Harvester tractor that, according to the bank, was worth far less than what Dad had borrowed against it. Maybe these relatives had come to claim their share of whatever little value remained. "I heard about the financial troubles from folks in town," Sarah continued, her directness both refreshing and alarming. "Banks talking about foreclosure, equipment loans that don't make sense for a farm this size." My defensive instincts kicked in, wondering how much these strangers knew about our business and what they wanted from me. "We're managing," I said carefully, using the same phrase Dad had always employed when neighbors got too curious about our finances. "Tommy," Sarah said gently, "I don't think you understand the situation you've inherited. That tractor sitting in your barn isn't just any old international harvester. It's a 1952 Super M that belonged to our grandfather, and it comes with some paperwork that might surprise you. The specific mention of the tractor's year and model suggested knowledge that went beyond casual observation, making me wonder what other family secrets I was about to discover. Chapter 6. The Real Story. Jim opened the manila folder and spread its contents across our kitchen table, revealing documents that looked official and important despite their age and wear. The papers included what appeared to be original purchase receipts, registration documents, and correspondence that dated back to the 1950s. Your grandfather bought this tractor new in 1952, Jim explained, pointing to a receipt that showed a purchase price of $2,400, which seemed like a fortune for that era. But he bought it with money that came from a very specific source. Sarah picked up the story, her voice taking on the cadence of someone sharing family history that had been carefully preserved. Grandpa Mitchell had discovered oil on his property in the 1940s, but instead of selling the rights to a big company, he negotiated a deal that gave him royalty payments for as long as the wells produced. The mention of oil made my heart race with possibilities I didn't dare believe. Our farm had never shown any signs of petroleum production, and Dad had never mentioned anything about mineral rights or royalties from previous generations. The oil company was based out of Oklahoma, Jim continued, and they kept meticulous records of every payment made to mineral rights holders. When Grandpa died, the royalties were supposed to pass to his heirs, but the paperwork got confused during probate. Sarah pulled out a document that looked more recent than the others, bearing the letterhead of a law firm in Tulsa, Oklahoma. We've been working with attorneys there to straighten out the inheritance issues. It turns out those mineral rights never expired, and the wells are still producing. The room seemed to spin slightly as I tried to process what they were telling me. The idea that our family had been entitled to oil royalties for decades without knowing it seemed too incredible to believe. But the papers in front of me looked legitimate and detailed. What does this have to do with the tractor? I asked, still struggling to understand how a 1952 International Harvester connected to Oklahoma oil rights. The tractor was bought with the first royalty check, Sarah explained, and according to the original purchase agreement, it serves as proof of the oil rights ownership. Whoever owns the tractor legally owns the mineral rights. Chapter 7. Proof of ownership. The implications of Sarah's explanation hit me like a physical blow, making me understand why Dad had always been so particular about that old tractor, and why he'd spent money we supposedly couldn't afford to keep it running properly. If what my cousin was saying was true, that beat-up machine represented far more than transportation and farm work. How much are we talking about? I asked, afraid to hope, but unable to ignore the possibility that our family's financial problems might have a solution I'd never imagined. Jim consulted another document from the folder, squinting at numbers that had been updated in different handwriting over the years. The wells have been producing consistently, and the royalty payments have been accumulating in an escrow account because the oil company couldn't locate the rightful heirs. Sarah leaned forward, her expression serious but excited. Tommy, we're talking about nearly $300,000 in back payments, plus ongoing monthly royalties of about $4,000 for as long as the wells keep producing. The numbers were so far beyond my comprehension that I had trouble processing them as real. $300,000 would not only pay off all our debts, but leave enough to modernize the farm and secure its future for another generation. $4,000 a month would provide the financial cushion that Dad and I had never enjoyed, allowing us to weather bad years without risking everything. Why are you telling me this? I asked, suspicious of generosity that seemed too good to be true. If the mineral rights have been disputed, what makes you think I'm the rightful heir? Sarah smiled, the expression transforming her weathered face and revealing the family resemblance I was beginning to recognize. Because we've already established our claim to part of the rights through our grandfather's will. But Sam's portion, which includes the tractor and the proof of purchase, belongs to you as his heir. Jim added, we could have tried to claim everything, but that wouldn't have been right. Family is family, even when we've been foolish enough to let pride keep us apart. The honesty in their voices and the detailed documentation they'd brought suggested this wasn't a scam or wishful thinking, but I still couldn't quite believe that decades of family financial struggles were about to end with the discovery of old papers in a cousin's filing cabinet. Chapter 8. The Authentication Process. The next morning, Sarah and Jim returned with a representative from the Oklahoma law firm who had been working on the mineral rights case. Attorney Margaret Walsh was a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who specialized in oil and gas law, and she brought additional documentation that helped verify the story my cousins had shared. The key piece of evidence, Walsh explained while examining our international harvester with the thoroughness of a detective, is the serial number on the tractor's engine block. It needs to match the number recorded on the original purchase receipt. We gathered around the old machine while Walsh consulted the paperwork and compared it to the stamped numbers on the engine. The tractor looked even more battered in the morning sunlight, its red paint faded, and its metal surfaces showing the wear of decades of honest farm work. "The numbers match perfectly," Walsh announced after several minutes of careful examination. "This is definitely the tractor purchased with the first oil royalty payment in 1952, which makes it the legal proof of mineral rights ownership." The authentication felt surreal, like watching someone appraise a priceless painting that I'd always assumed was just a cheap reproduction. Dad had never treated the tractor as anything special beyond its practical value, but apparently he'd understood its significance in ways he'd never shared with me. "Why didn't my father tell me about this?" I asked, still struggling to understand how such important information had been kept secret for so long. Sarah looked uncomfortable for the first time since her arrival. Sam was angry about the family dispute when we stopped talking. He probably figured the oil rights were lost forever and didn't want to get your hopes up about money that might never come. Walsh added her professional perspective. "It's actually common for mineral rights inheritance to get confused over generations. The original lease agreements often contained language that wasn't clear about how rights transferred to heirs, which is why we've been able to recover funds that were stuck in legal limbo. The process of claiming our inheritance would still require legal work and patience, but Walsh assured me that the case was solid, and the money was real." Chapter 9. Facing the Bank. Armed with documentation of the oil rights and a letter from Walsh's law firm, I made an appointment with First National Bank to discuss our debt situation with loan officer Robert Davidson. Davidson was a thin, nervous man who'd always treated Dad with polite skepticism, clearly viewing our small operation as a risky investment. "Mr. Mitchell," Davidson said with the careful tone he reserved for customers behind on their payments, "I appreciate you coming in, but I'm afraid your situation hasn't improved since your father's passing. We need to discuss liquidation options." I placed Walsh's letter and copies of the mineral rights documents on his desk, watching his expression change from professional sympathy to confused interest as he read through the legal explanation of our oil inheritance. "This is unexpected," Davidson admitted after reading the letter twice. "If these mineral rights are legitimate, they would certainly change our assessment of your creditworthiness." The banker's sudden shift from threatening foreclosure to calculating potential profits reminded me why Dad had always distrusted financial institutions. Davidson's interest in our welfare seemed directly proportional to our ability to generate revenue for his bank. "We'll need our legal department to verify these documents," Davidson continued. "But assuming everything checks out, we can certainly restructure your loans to reflect your improved financial position." The meeting ended with handshakes and promises of cooperation that felt hollow compared to the years of struggle Dad and I had endured while building our operation. But I couldn't deny the relief of knowing that our farm would survive and potentially thrive despite the challenges we'd faced. Driving home from the bank, I passed the cemetery where Dad was buried and wished I could share the news that would have lifted such a burden from his shoulders. The irony that our salvation had been sitting in our barn all along wasn't lost on me, but it also highlighted how much my father had sacrificed to protect me from financial worries that had consumed his final years. Chapter 10. Processing the Truth. That evening, I sat on the farmhouse porch with Sarah and Jim, watching the sun set over fields that now represented security, rather than an impossible financial burden. The transformation from desperation to hope had happened so quickly that I was still struggling to accept the reality of our changed circumstances. "I keep thinking Dad knew more than he let on," I said, trying to piece together clues from our conversations over the... "He was always particular about that tractor, making sure it ran properly even when we could barely afford parts for the other equipment." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "Sam was protecting you the same way our grandfather protected him. When you grow up with money worries, you learn not to count on windfalls that might disappear." Jim added his perspective as someone who'd married into the Mitchell family dynamics. "Your father probably figured that if the oil rights were real, you'd discover them eventually. If they weren't, at least you wouldn't spend your life chasing false hopes." The conversation helped me understand Dad's secretiveness as protection rather than deception. but I still felt frustrated by the years of unnecessary struggle we'd endured. The monthly oil royalties alone would have eliminated the stress that had contributed to his heart problems. "What happens now?" I asked, looking at the farm buildings and equipment that would need attention once our financial situation stabilized. Sarah smiled, her expression reflecting the satisfaction of resolving a family dispute that had lasted too long. "Now you get to do what your father always wanted. Run this farm without worrying about money every single day." The prospect of farming without constant financial pressure seemed almost foreign after a lifetime of making do with second-hand equipment and deferred maintenance. But it also represented the opportunity to honor Dad's memory by building something sustainable and successful. "There's one more thing," Jim said, pulling another document from his ever-present folder. "The law firm thinks there might be additional mineral rights tied to other family property. This inheritance could be even larger than we first thought." Chapter 11. Building Something Better. 6 months after Dad's funeral, I stood in the same cemetery holding architectural plans for a new barn that would replace the structure that had been patching and repatching for decades. The oil royalty payments had arrived as promised, providing both the back payments and ongoing monthly income that transformed our farm from a struggling operation to a thriving business. The first thing I'd done with the money was pay off all our debts, including the equipment loans that had seemed impossible to manage. The banker who'd been threatening foreclosure now called regularly with investment opportunities and suggestions for expanding our operation. But more importantly, I'd been able to honor Dad's memory by implementing improvements he'd always talked about, but never had the resources to achieve. New fencing, upgraded irrigation systems, and modern equipment were turning our farm into the kind of operation he'd dreamed of building. Sarah and Jim had become regular visitors, helping me navigate decisions about land management and investment while rebuilding the family connections that pride had severed 20 years earlier. Their expertise and support filled some of the void left by Dad's passing, though nothing could replace the partnership we'd shared. "Sam would be proud of what you're doing," Sarah said, examining the barn plans with the eye of someone who understood both farming and construction. "He always said this place had potential if it just had the right resources." The new barn would include modern milking facilities, expanded storage for feed and equipment, and workshop space for maintaining machinery properly instead of making do with temporary repairs. It represented the kind of investment in the future that Dad had never been able to make. "I wish he could see it," I said, voicing the thought that accompanied every major decision I made about the farm's development. "He can," Jim replied with the quiet confidence of someone who'd lost his own parents and found peace with their memory. "Every time you make this place better instead of just surviving, you're showing him that his sacrifice wasn't wasted." The truth in his words helped ease the guilt I'd been carrying about prospering from resources Dad had never been able to access. Chapter 12. Full Circle. A year after learning about our oil inheritance, I hosted the first Mitchell family reunion in over 2 decades, bringing together cousins and relatives who'd scattered across several states, but maintained connections to our shared agricultural heritage. The gathering took place in the shadow of the new barn, which had been completed on schedule and exceeded all my expectations for functionality and efficiency. The International Harvester tractor that had proven our ownership of the mineral rights occupied a place of honor in the new building, fully restored but still functional enough to use for special occasions. Its transformation from utilitarian farm equipment to family heirloom reflected our own journey from struggle to prosperity. "It's funny how things work out," Sarah observed while admiring the restored tractor. "All those years of fighting over property and equipment, and it turns out there was plenty for everyone." The family reunion had attracted 43 relatives, including some I'd never met, but who shared the Mitchell name and farming heritage that connected us across generations. Their stories of struggles and successes helped me understand that our experience of financial hardship, followed by unexpected inheritance, wasn't unique in families that had worked the land for multiple generations. Children played in the farmyard, while adults shared stories of previous generations, creating connections that would outlast the oil wells and mineral rights that had brought us back together. The reunion represented healing of wounds that had divided our family for too long. Evening found us gathered around a bonfire, sharing memories of ancestors who'd cleared the land and built the foundations we still depended on. The stories helped me appreciate that our farm represented more than just business or inheritance. It was a link to family history that deserved preservation. "Next year we'll do this again," I announced, looking around the circle of faces illuminated by firelight. Dad always said family was the most important crop you could cultivate. The reunion ended with promises to stay in touch and plans for future gatherings that would strengthen bonds forged by shared heritage and renewed by mutual understanding. Chapter 13. Legacy Secured. Standing in the same fields where my father had taught me to drive a tractor, plant crops, and understand the rhythm of seasons that governed our lives, I reflected on how dramatically our circumstances had changed, while our core values remained constant. The oil money had provided security and opportunity, but the real inheritance was the land itself and the knowledge passed down through generations of Mitchell farmers. The new barn housed modern equipment that would have amazed Dad with its efficiency and capabilities, but the fundamental work remained the same: caring for livestock, tending crops, and stewarding the land for future generations. The financial pressure that had consumed his final years was gone, replaced by the freedom to farm for satisfaction rather than mere survival. Monthly royalty checks continued to arrive, providing ongoing income that allowed me to expand our operation and employ several local workers who appreciated steady jobs in an uncertain economy. The farm had grown from a struggling family operation to a significant employer in our rural community. More importantly, the restoration of family connections had enriched my life in ways that money couldn't measure. Regular contact with Sarah, Jim, and other relatives provided the support network that Dad had missed during his years of self-imposed isolation from family disputes. The International Harvester tractor still started on the first try, though I rarely used it for actual work now that we owned more efficient equipment. But every time I climbed into its worn seat, I felt connected to both my father's memory and our family's long history of working this land. On quiet evenings, I often walked the property boundaries, checking on livestock and crops while appreciating the transformation that had occurred since that devastating day when I'd learned about our impossible debts. The miracle we'd needed had been sitting in our barn all along, waiting for the right family connections to reveal its significance. Dad's dream of passing our farm to the next generation was now secure, supported by resources that would allow future Mitchells to choose farming because they loved it rather than because they had no other options. That freedom to choose represented the best possible legacy for a man who'd sacrificed everything to preserve our family's agricultural heritage. Thank you for listening to my story about discovering that sometimes our greatest treasures are hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right moment and the right people to reveal their true value. I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Please tell me what part of the world you're listening from, and consider subscribing to the channel for more stories about family, farming, and the unexpected ways life can surprise us. Your support means everything to me as I continue sharing these tales that celebrate the resilience and determination of rural families everywhere.